Today I'm going to tell you the story of a rancher who found an Apache girl alone by the fire. Jake Morrison discovered Aiyana abandoned after a cavalry attack that completely destroyed her camp. But the outcome exceeded all expectations. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening to this story from. Chapter 1. The Lonely Fire. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged Arizona landscape as Jake Morrison guided his horse down the rocky slope. The 42-year-old rancher had been tracking his stolen cattle for 3 days, following hoof prints and broken branches through the unforgiving terrain. His weathered face, marked by years of desert sun and hard work, showed the strain of sleepless nights and growing concern. The air still carried the acrid smell of smoke from somewhere ahead. Jake's jaw tightened. Smoke in Apache territory meant trouble, and he'd already heard the distant thunder of cavalry horses 2 days prior. The army had been conducting sweeps through the region, a polite term for driving out the remaining Apache bands who refused to surrender to reservation life. As Jake crested a small ridge, he pulled his horse to an abrupt halt. Below, in a protected alcove between 2 massive boulders, the smoldering remains of what had been a small Apache camp lay scattered across the ground. Torn blankets, overturned cooking pots, and the skeletal remains of wickiups told the story of a hasty retreat, or worse. But it was the small figure huddled by the dying fire that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. A young Apache girl, number more than 8 or 9 years old, sat perfectly still beside the glowing embers. Her long black hair hung like a curtain around her face, and her small hands clutched a torn piece of colorful fabric, probably from a dress or blanket. She hadn't looked up at his approach, hadn't acknowledged his presence at all. Jake dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravelly ground. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, but still the child didn't move. As he stepped closer, he could see her shoulders trembling, whether from cold, fear, or shock. He couldn't tell. "Easy there, little one," Jake said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He'd learned enough Apache words during his 15 years in Arizona to attempt basic communication, but the girl remained motionless. The camp around them told a devastating story. Scattered belongings suggested the inhabitants had fled quickly, leaving behind everything they couldn't carry. Jake's experienced eye noted the absence of bodies, which gave him hope. Perhaps they'd escaped the cavalry's advance. But why had they left this child behind? Jake knelt slowly, about 10 feet from the girl, careful not to make any sudden movements. "My name is Jake," he said gently, switching between English and his limited Apache vocabulary. "Jake Morrison. I won't hurt you." Finally, the girl raised her head. Her dark eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and defiance, met his. Despite her obvious terror, there was something fierce in her gaze, a strength that reminded Jake of a cornered wildcat. Tears had carved clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks, but her jaw was set with determination. Double quotes, where ... "Donde esta tu familia?" Jake asked, mixing English and Spanish, hoping she might understand. "Your family?" The girl's lower lip trembled, but she didn't answer. Instead, she looked back toward the fire, then at the scattered remains of the camp. Her small hand tightened around the piece of fabric she held. Jake's heart clenched as understanding dawned. The cavalry hadn't just scattered this group, they'd torn apart a family. And somehow, this brave little girl had been left behind in the chaos. The rancher looked around the devastated camp once more, his mind racing. He couldn't leave her here alone. The desert was unforgiving, especially to a child, and there were dangers beyond just the harsh environment. Other cavalry patrols, wild animals, and the bitter cold of desert nights would claim her life within days, but taking her with him would bring its own complications. The tensions between settlers and Apache had reached a breaking point, and many folks in town wouldn't look kindly on him, harboring an Apache child, even one so young and obviously abandoned. Jake studied the girl's face, seeing past the dirt, and tears to the intelligence and spirit that blazed in her dark eyes. This wasn't just about doing what was right, though that certainly factored into his decision. Something about her reminded him of his own daughter, Sarah, who died of fever 3 years ago. The same stubborn tilt of the chin, the same refusal to show weakness even when the world seemed to be crumbling around her. "Look, little warrior," Jake said softly, using the Apache word he'd learned for a brave child. "I can't leave you here. It's not safe." He slowly reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of jerky and his water canteen. Setting them on the ground between them, he backed away slightly. "Food, water, parati," he said, gesturing toward the offerings. The girls. Eyes flicked to the food, and Jake could see her internal struggle. Hunger and thirst warred with fear and caution. After several long moments, she reached out quickly, snatched the jerky, and retreated to her original position. As she ate, Jake continued talking in low, soothing tones, mixing English, Spanish, and the few Apache phrases he knew. He told her about his ranch, about his horses, about the sunrise over the mountains. He wasn't sure she understood the words, but perhaps his tone would convey his peaceful intentions. The sun was climbing higher, and Jake knew he needed to make a decision soon. The desert heat would become dangerous for both of them, and he still had no idea if there were other cavalry patrols in the area. "Mi casa," he said finally, pointing toward the direction of his ranch. "Safe, seguro, food, water, shelter." The girl studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his soul. Then, surprising him completely, she spoke for the first time. "Aiyana," she said quietly, placing her small hand over her heart. Jake's throat tightened with emotion. She was telling him her name, a gesture of trust that felt monumental given the circumstances. "Aiyana," he repeated carefully, then pointed to himself. "Jake," she nodded solemnly, then looked once more around the destroyed camp. When her gaze returned to him, Jake saw that she'd made her decision. Chapter 2. The long road home. The journey back to Jake's ranch stretched across 27 miles of harsh desert terrain, but it felt like crossing an entire continent. Aiyana rode behind him on his horse, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her body rigid with tension. Every sound, the call of a hawk, the rustle of wind through sage brush, the distant howl of a coyote made her grip tighten. Jake had draped his spare blanket around her shoulders, but he could still feel her shivering against his back. Whether from cold, fear, or the aftershock of trauma, he couldn't tell. Probably all three. "Easy, little warrior," he murmured over his shoulder as they navigated a particularly rocky section of the trail. "We're almost to the waterhole. The horses need rest." Aiyana didn't respond, but her grip loosened slightly. Jake had been talking to her steadily for the past 2 hours, maintaining a gentle stream of conversation in his mixture of English, Spanish, and broken Apache. He wasn't sure how much she understood, but his voice seemed to calm her. When they reached the natural spring, hidden among a cluster of cottonwood trees, Jake dismounted carefully and helped Aiyana down. Her legs were unsteady after the long ride, and she stumbled slightly before catching herself. Pride flickered across her face at the momentary weakness, and Jake pretended not to notice. "Water's sweet here," Jake said, cupping his hands to drink from the spring. "My father showed me this place when I was about your age. Said the Apache had used it for generations." Aiyana approached the water cautiously, as if expecting it to disappear. When she finally knelt and drank, Jake saw her shoulders relax for the first time since he'd found her. The familiar taste of the spring water seemed to anchor her somehow. While the horses rested, Jake shared more of his food with her hardtack, dried fruit, and another piece of jerky. She ate slowly, carefully, as if each bite might be her last. The sight broke Jake's heart and strengthened his resolve simultaneously. "Tell me about your family," Jake said gently, settling onto a flat rock nearby. "Too familiar. What happened?" "Aiyana's." Hands stilled on the piece of bread she'd been eating. For a moment, Jake thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in halting English mixed with Apache words, she began to speak. "Soldiers come. Early morning. Many horses, many guns." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but each word carried the weight. "Of witnessed horror. Grandmother say run, fast, to the rocks." Jake's jaw clenched as he imagined the scene cavalry thundering into a peaceful camp at dawn, scattering families like leaves in a storm. "But you didn't run," he observed quietly. Aiyana shook her head, tears threatening to spill over again. "Little brother, sick, could not walk fast." She pressed her hand to her chest, over her heart. "I stay. Help him hide." "Where is he now?" "Gone." The single word carried infinite sadness. "When soldiers leave, I look. Empty, all empty." Jake closed his eyes briefly, understanding now why she'd been alone by the fire. She'd sacrificed her own safety to protect a sick sibling, and when the chaos ended, she'd found herself abandoned in the ruins of her world. "You're brave," Jake said simply, "braver than most grown men I know." Aiyana studied his face, as if trying to determine whether he was mocking her or speaking truth. Something in his expression must have convinced her of his sincerity, because she nodded, once a small gesture of acknowledgement. They rested for another hour before continuing their journey. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Jake found himself grateful for the broad brim of his hat. Aiyana had no such protection, so he adjusted his spare bandana to shade her face as much as possible as they rode. Jake began telling her about his ranch, the Rolling M, named after the Morrison family brand. He described the house his grandfather had built, the barn where he kept his horses, the vegetable garden that his late wife had planted, and he'd been struggling to maintain alone. "It's not much," he said honestly, "but it's peaceful, safe. You'd have your own room, your own bed. And Mary Chun, she's the woman who helps me with cooking and cleaning. She's got a gentle way about her. Lost her own family in the war, so she understands about being alone." Jake felt Aiyana's posture change slightly. The mention of another woman seemed to intrigue her, though she remained silent. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when they finally crested the hill overlooking Jake's property. The ranch house sat in a sheltered valley, a modest adobe structure with a red tile roof and a wide front porch. Corrals and outbuildings dotted the landscape, and a small orchard of fruit trees provided shade near the main house. "There she is," Jake said with genuine affection in his voice. "Home." Aiyana's grip on his waist tightened again, but this time it felt different, not fear, but uncertainty about what awaited her in this strange new world. As they rode down the winding path toward the house, Jake spotted Mary Chun hanging laundry on the line behind the kitchen. The middle-aged Chinese woman looked up at the sound of approaching hooves, her weathered face creasing into a smile of relief. "Jake Morrison," she called out in accented English, dropping the sheet she'd been hanging. "3 days I worry about you. And who is this little one?" Jake dismounted and helped Aiyana down, keeping one protective hand on her shoulder as Mary approached. The older woman's eyes immediately took in the child's torn clothing, the mixture of fear and defiance in her dark eyes, and the way she pressed close to Jake's side. "This is Aiyana," Jake said quietly. "She needs our help." Mary's expression softened instantly. Without asking for explanations or expressing any surprise at finding an Apache child at their doorstep, she knelt down to Aiyana's eye level. "Hello, little flower," Mary said gently, using the Mandarin word for flower and then translating. You are safe here. Come, you must be hungry and tired." Aiyana looked up at Jake uncertainly. He nodded encouragingly, and after a moment's hesitation, she allowed Mary to lead her toward the house dot as Jake watched them walk away, the practical, kind-hearted woman and the traumatized Apache girl. He felt the weight of the decision he'd made settling on his shoulders. Taking in Aiyana wasn't just about providing temporary shelter. Given what had happened to her family, this might be her permanent home. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as he watched Mary's gentle ministrations and saw Aiyana's tentative response to kindness, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years' hope. But he also knew that the real challenges lay ahead. The townspeople, the authorities, the lingering tensions between Apache and settlers, all of that would have to be navigated carefully. For now, though, Aiyana was safe, fed, and beginning to trust Dot. It was a start. Chapter 3. Facing the storm, 2 weeks had passed since Aiyana's arrival at the Rolling M, and Jake was beginning to see glimpses of the spirited child beneath the layers of trauma. She'd established routines helping Mary with kitchen tasks, feeding chickens, and watching sunset paint the mountains each evening. Her nightmares had lessened, and she'd even smiled when Jake carved her a wooden horse. But their fragile peace shattered when dust clouds announced unwelcome visitors, riders. "Coming," Mary observed, wiping flour from her apron. "Many riders." Jake stepped onto the porch, hand moving to his rifle. Through shimmering heat, he counted 6 horsemen approaching at a deliberate pace. Sun glinted off badges and weapons. This wasn't a friendly visit. "Aiyana," he called softly. The girl appeared instantly from where she'd been sketching in the dirt with a stick. "Go inside with Mary. Stay away from the windows." Her dark eyes widened with terror she'd learned to suppress. 2 weeks of safety hadn't erased the memory of cavalry thundering into her camp. She'd learned to read danger in adult voices, in the sudden stillness before violence. The riders drew closer, and Jake recognized the lead horseman, Sheriff Thomas. Garrett, whose weathered face and steel-gray mustache commanded respect throughout the territory. Behind him rode Deputy Mills, 3 local ranchers Jake knew by sight, and a dusty cavalry officer whose blue uniform bore lieutenant's bars. "Morrison," Garrett called, reining his horse 20 feet from the porch. "We need to talk." "Sheriff," Jake replied evenly, not moving from his defensive position. "What brings you all the way out here?" Garrett dismounted, spurs jangling as he approached the porch steps with the measured gait of a man who delivered bad news before. The others remained mounted, hands resting casually but meaningfully near their weapons, a show of force designed to intimidate. "Word's gotten around town," Garrett began, his voice carrying the weight of official business, "about you harboring an Apache child. That true?" Jake's jaw tightened. He'd known this moment would come, had hoped for more time. "I found a lost child. Did what any decent person would do." "Decent?" One of the ranchers, Pete Hawkins, spat tobacco juice into the dust, his face twisted with old hatred. "That child's Apache, Morrison. Her people killed my brother last month during the raid on Willow Creek. She's 8 years old, Pete. She didn't kill anyone." The cavalry officer urged his horse forward, brass buttons gleaming in the harsh sunlight. "Lieutenant Bradley, Fort McDowell. That child belongs on the reservation with her people. It's official military policy regarding all Apache miners." "Her people are dead," Jake said flatly, his voice carrying the weight of witnessed tragedy. "I found her alone by the smoking remains of her camp." "Your boys saw to that." Bradley's face flushed red above his blue collar. "We're conducting lawful military operations against documented hostile forces operating in violation of treaty." "Hostile?" Jake's voice rose, anger breaking through his controlled demeanor. "She weighs 60 pounds soaking wet and cries for her grandmother every night. Apache is Apache, Hawkins growled, his scarred hands gripping his reins tighter. They grow up hating whites, planning revenge. Better to deal with the problem now, before it gets bigger. Jake stepped down from the porch, his 6-foot frame suddenly dangerous in its stillness. You suggesting we harm a child, Pete? I'm suggesting you stop being a goddamn fool. Hawkins shot back, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. That girl's a viper, waiting to bite the hand that feeds her. Sheriff Garrett raised his hand, cutting off the escalating argument. Enough, both of you. Morrison, the territorial law's crystal clear on this matter. Apache children go to the reservation or approved government institutions. You simply cannot keep her. The hell I can't. Jake, Garrett's voice carried the warning of an old friend who'd rather not arrest him. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We'll take her peaceful like to Fort McDowell. They'll see she's properly placed with appropriate supervision. Properly placed? Jake laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the desert air. You mean locked up with strangers who don't speak her language, don't know her story, don't give a damn if she lives or dies? Through the window behind him, Jake caught movement Aiyana's. Frightened face pressed against the glass, Mary's protective arm around her small shoulders. The sight of her terror strengthened his resolve like steel heated in a forge. She stays here, Jake said firmly, planting his feet. I'll adopt her legally if that's what it takes. Adopt an Apache? Hawkins sneered, his voice dripping disbelief. Jesus Christ, Morrison, you gone completely loco from too much desert sun? Watch your mouth when you're on my land, Pete. The tension crackled like lightning before a thunderstorm. Deputy Mills shifted nervously in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this confrontation was heading. Lieutenant Bradley's hand moved incrementally closer to his sidearm. Last chance, Morrison, Garrett said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. Hand over the child voluntarily, or we take her by force. Don't make me do something we'll both regret. Jake's rifle came up in one smooth motion, the barrel aimed steadily at Garrett's chest. Years of hunting had made the movement instinctive, natural as breathing. First man who tries dies where he stands. The mounted men reached for their weapons, but Jake's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. I've got 6 shots in this rifle and a pistol on my hip. How many of you want to die today for Pete Hawkins' hatred? You're making a serious mistake. Civilian, Bradley warned, his military bearing rigid with authority. Maybe so, Lieutenant, but it's my mistake to make. For long, deadly moments, nobody moved. Desert wind whispered through sage brush with the sound of distant voices. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, crying its lonesome call into the vast blue sky. Finally, Sheriff Garrett spoke, his words measured and final. You got 3 days, Morrison. 3 days to come to your senses and bring that child to town voluntarily. After that, I come back with a federal warrant and enough men to finish this business permanently. Jake nodded grimly, his rifle never wavering. 3 days it is, then. The sheriff remounted with the stiff movements of a man feeling his age, his weathered face grim with the knowledge of what was coming. Don't be foolish, Jake. This path won't end well for anyone, especially not for the girl. As the riders departed in a cloud of dust and jangling spurs, Jake remained on the porch until the hoofbeats faded completely into the desert silence. Only then did he lower his rifle, his hands trembling slightly from spent adrenaline. Mary and Aiyana emerged from the house, the older woman's face creased with worry, the child's dark eyes wide but determined. She'd understood enough English and read enough tension to know her fate hung in the balance. What happens now? Mary asked quietly, her accented voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked down at Aiyana, seeing not an Apache or a political problem to be solved, but simply a frightened child who'd already lost everything once and needed someone to stand between her and a world that wanted to take her away again. "Now we figure out how to keep our family together," he said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. Chapter 4. A New Dawn. The 3 days passed like a fever dream. Jake spent sleepless nights planning, weighing options, each more desperate than the last. Running wasn't realistic. Where could they go that law wouldn't follow? Fighting meant certain death. But surrender meant losing Aiyana forever. On the morning of the 3rd day, Jake made an unexpected decision. "We're going to town," he announced over breakfast. Mary's chopsticks paused. "Jake, that's exactly what they won't expect." Jake's weathered face showed new determination. "We face this head-on, but on our terms." Aiyana looked between them, understanding the gravity without grasping details. She'd grown to trust Jake's judgment, sensing his protective nature in every gesture. They rode into Copper Creek at noon when the sun blazed overhead. Jake had dressed carefully, his best shirt, cleanest hat, the appearance of a respectable rancher rather than a desperate fugitive. Aiyana sat before him, wearing a simple blue dress Mary had sewn from spare fabric. The town's main street stretched dusty and wide between weathered buildings. The general store, saloon, church, and sheriff's office formed the heart of this frontier. Community. People stopped their conversations to stare as Jake's horse clopped down the center of the street. "Morrison's lost his mind," someone whispered, bringing that Apache child right into town. Jake ignored the murmurs, riding straight to the church. Reverend Samuel Hayes stood on the steps, his black coat stark against white painted wood. The elderly minister's eyes widened at their approach. "Reverend," Jake called, dismounting and helping Aiyana down. "I need to speak with you, privately." Hayes glanced around nervously at the gathering crowd. "Perhaps this isn't the best time. It's the only time I've got." Inside the simple church, sunlight streamed through plain glass windows, illuminating wooden pews and a modest altar. Jake had attended services here sporadically, mainly for his late wife's sake. "Reverend, I need you to perform a ceremony." Jake began without preamble. "What kind of ceremony?" "An adoption, legal and binding before God and witnesses." Hayes's face paled. "Jake, you can't be serious. Adopting an Apache child?" The territorial laws say nothing about formal adoption by a legal guardian." "I've checked." Jake had spent hours reviewing legal documents. "If I adopt her officially, with proper witnesses and documentation, they can't just take her. But the community response will be what it is." Jake's voice carried quiet steel. "I'm asking you as a man of God, would Christ turn away a child in need?" Hayes studied Aiyana, who stood quietly beside Jake, her dark eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Something in her dignity, her quiet courage, seemed to move the minister. "The adoption would need witnesses," Hayes said slowly. "Respectable members of the community, already arranged." Jake nodded toward the door. "Mary Chun, Doc Patterson, and Judge Wilson are waiting outside." Hayes's eyebrows rose. "Judge Wilson agreed to this?" "He lost his own granddaughter to scarlet fever last year. He understands about protecting children." Through the windows, they could see Sheriff Garrett and his men approaching, dust clouds marking their urgent ride from the fort. Time was running short. "Reverend," Jake pressed, "I'm not asking you to approve of everything I've done. I'm asking you to help save a child's life." Hayes looked at Aiyana again, seeing past the cultural divide to the frightened little girl beneath. After a long moment, he nodded. "Bring in your witnesses." The ceremony was brief but profound. Judge Wilson, despite his official position, spoke the legal words with genuine warmth. Doc Patterson, who delivered half the babies in the county, smiled encouragingly at Aiyana. Mary held the girl's hand throughout the proceedings. "Do you, Jacob Morrison, take this child as your legal daughter to protect, provide for, and raise. As your own? I do. And do you, Aiyana, accept Jacob Morrison as your father? Aiyana looked up at Jake, her dark eyes serious. In careful English, she spoke the words Mary had taught her. I do. When Garrett burst through the church doors, the ceremony was complete. Legal documents signed, witnessed, and sealed. You're too late, Sheriff, Judge Wilson announced with satisfaction. This child is now legally adopted under territorial law. Garrett's face flushed red. This is some kind of trick. It's completely legal, the judge interrupted. I've reviewed every statute. Mr. Morrison has full parental rights. Lieutenant Bradley pushed past Garrett. Military authority supersedes military. Authority over a legally adopted civilian child? Judge Wilson's voice carried decades of courtroom experience. I think not, Lieutenant. The standoff stretched tense moments. Then Aiyana stepped forward, her small hand slipping into Jake's larger one. The simple gesture spoke volumes about choice, about family bonds that transcended law and prejudice. Sheriff. Garrett studied the assembled group-respected community members, standing unified behind an unlikely family. His shoulders sagged with the weight of political reality. This isn't over, he warned quietly. Yes, it is, Jake replied firmly. She's my daughter now. Anyone who wants to hurt her goes through me. As the official party departed, the small congregation remained in the church. Sunlight painted everything golden, and for the first time in weeks, Jake felt genuine peace. What happens now, Papa? Aiyana asked, testing the new word carefully. Jake knelt beside her, his throat tight with emotion. Now we go home. We're a family. Mary smiled through tears. Family. Doc Patterson chuckled. Going to be interesting times ahead. Judge Wilson gathered his papers. Interesting indeed. But sometimes interesting is exactly what a community needs. They rode home as the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Aiyana sat confidently. Now, no longer the terrified child Jake had found by a dying fire, but a daughter secure in her father's protection knot at the ranch. Mary prepared a celebration dinner while Jake and Aiyana sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Tell me about the stars, Aiyana requested, her voice carrying the confidence of a child who knew she was loved. Jake pointed to the constellations, sharing stories his own father had told him years ago. As he spoke, he realized that in saving Aiyana, she had somehow saved him to giving him purpose, family, and hope for the future. The girl who had been left behind by tragedy had found her way home. And in doing so, she'd taught a lonely rancher that sometimes the most unlikely families are the strongest ones of all. In the distance, a coyote called to the moon, its voice carrying across the desert like an ancient blessing on new beginnings.